What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite vampire games. With the recent release of Redfall, video games with vampires in them have been on my mind a little bit, and I thought it would be fun to talk about a few of my favorites, as vampires in media tend to be a very diverse bit of fantasy, as there's so much surrounding vampires and how they work that oftentimes their representation in any given media feels like a bit of a grab bag of various myths and legends about vampires, which makes how they're presented in individual games and, again, just media in general, vary pretty wildly. But nonetheless, there are a few of my favorites, which is naturally what we're here to talk about today. Kicking this video off the right way with the one and only Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, because what is a list like this without the, frankly, best vampire game out there? I'm a big fan of the world of darkness that this is set in, and specifically Vampire the Masquerade is one of my favorite franchises, and it's a shame it really hasn't gotten a ton of video games, but luckily Bloodlines is an amazing title, where we get to roleplay one of several clans of vampires, each with their own distinct traits and play style that make playing through the game with each one of them feel distinct, on top of encountering all sorts of characters that are incredibly memorable. All makes for an experience that really walks a sort of tightrope between the very serious aspects of it and the also sort of cheesy humor that can easily accommodate things like vampires, and altogether that stuff made Bloodlines a unique title with a ton of longevity, which is why it enjoys its cult classic status these days. Second on the list, though, we have Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, a game I don't think I've ever actually mentioned on the channel before, despite obviously having played it. Soul Reaver was the follow-up to Blood Omen, and in Soul Reaver we play the role of Raziel, about 1500 years after the events of Blood Omen. But both Soul Reaver and the series at large tells the long and elaborate story of Kain and Raziel, which involves vampires and the humans of Nosgoth, and the back and forth between all of them throughout history, alongside some more cosmic elements at times. But one of the reasons I love Soul Reaver in particular is that, for starters, it was one of the first vampire games I had ever played, and I thought Raziel looked incredibly cool all the way back in the early 2000s. But what I appreciate more about this game today is that it sees the world brought to the brink of collapse by the vampire clans. They've effectively dominated the entire landscape at the timeline of this game, with both the land and civilization at large pretty much facing extinction. All while we, Raziel, attempt to get back at Kain for casting us into a pit that saw us revived from our life as a vampire into a wraith, and the story only gets more complicated from there. But Soul Reaver was a very unique game. It did some unique things mechanically that I won't go over here, but it's a game that 20 years on still sticks out in my memory when I think about vampire games, and I might actually get around to covering it on the channel at some point. Third on the list, we have V Rising, the recently released, at least in terms of the games on this list, vampire title that sees us awakening after centuries of slumber, ready to regain our strength, build up our own stronghold, as well as take on various vampire hunters. This game has a bit of a crafting element to it, where we'll be actually building up our own sort of gothic castle to plot our machinations within, all while mastering all sorts of unholy abilities to both hunt and track down unique types of blood to further increase your powers. And there's even co-op elements that can see you competing with other players or playing along with them. And altogether, I think that makes V Rising a very compelling experience. It's a game that I've enjoyed quite a bit, although currently it's technically in early access, and even in early access, it's easily cemented its place as one of my favorites. And I'm looking forward to its actual full launch, because just what they have on offer in early access is pretty impressive. But that does bring us to our fourth entry, and this is Vampyr. Don't Nod's very narrative-heavy adventure where we play a doctor-turned-vampire at the height of the Spanish influenza, which just so happens to coincide with a vampire-oriented outbreak that we are uniquely suited to track down and solve. That said, Vampyr is a wonderful game with some mechanics that really lean into the vampire aspect of things, especially with how the game scales its difficulty based on how often you're feeding off of people, with feeding on people actually being what grants you more experience, or at least large amounts of it, and getting the most experience out of individual people involves curing every one of their ailments, as we are a doctor after all, but also learning new things about them to maximize your knowledge of them, which basically amounts to toying with your food before you eat it. So all in all, big fan of Vampyr. It's a game that takes itself very seriously though, which the jankier animations don't always keep up with, but easily one of the best vampire games out there. I'm a big fan of it. Though that does bring us to our final entry, and this is good old-fashioned Skyrim. Now, Skyrim's a bit of an interesting case because I think the Dawnguard expansion added a bunch of things with vampire lords that allow you to do a lot of fun and cool stuff that makes playing as a vampire a blast. However, you can take that even farther with mods if you should so choose, because they are plentiful and will add even more to the experience. There are some very high-profile vampire mods out there, but even without those, playing as a vampire lord is incredibly cool, especially at the time it actually released. While it might be a little cheesy now, sure, to go from the regular vampires that were available to being given a full-on transformation with all sorts of unique powers and its own perk tree and everything was just a real blast for me. And it's a bit more of a power fantasy, I would say, than it is a role-playing part of it, depending on how, let's say, involved you want to get in the role-playing. However, for me, Skyrim's a great game for power fantasy in general, and that extends to the vampire side of things, which is why it's always just been one of my favorite things to do. That said, I doubt you need me to tell you more about Skyrim these days, so I think we'll leave it at that. That has been 5 of my favorite vampire games. I certainly hope you enjoyed this list. By all means, let me know what your favorite vampire games are down below. I'd love to hear all about it. But more than anything, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.